We have, according to the original schedule for the class, we have 3 weeks left after tonight. Because of some lost time in December, as well as the gas leak, and then the night that it was supposed to snow and didn't, and I canceled class and totally regretted it afterwards, I'm a couple weeks behind. I could finish in 3 weeks if we need to maintain that original schedule. It's going to be real tight. Every week's going to be jam-packed full of stuff, and I'm going to have to skip a lot of questions in order to do that. But I want to make sure before I just unanimously vote on my own to have a 4th week, that's going to be okay with everyone's schedule. I'm not going to make anyone feel like they're kind of missing out on the last bit of class to do that. So is there anyone who's like super objects to adding a 4th week to the end of this?
April 4th. Good.
But don't tempt me, because I could.
Hey, John, you can have a whole other study as far as we're concerned.
Well, we'll see what happens. I was talking with Kristen
I
about
think we could read our Bibles from right to left.
I'll get you a Hebrew one, and then you sure can.
This would be just start at the, go backwards.
Oh, well, good. Okay, so I'll plan on that and make the schedule accordingly. So that means that 1, 2, 3, 4. So for next week, we're going to read chapters 13 through 19. I'll send that out in the email again tomorrow for anyone who's not here at the moment and is still on their way. And then we'll kick tonight off with a video on Deuteronomy, which is super cool. So,
the book of Deuteronomy, the epic conclusion to Torah, and spoiler alert, Moses is going to die.
Oh, yeah.
Now, in order to understand this book, we need to remember the story so far.
So Israel has escaped from slavery in Egypt. Then they spend 1 year at Mount Sinai.
This is where they made the covenant with God to obey all of these laws.
Then they wander around the desert for 40 years before they make it to the Jordan River, which is right across from the land God promised them. They're ready to go in. This is where the book of Deuteronomy begins.
And what this book is really is a speech. Moses gives these final words. It's like a pep talk to the new generation of Israel that's about to go into the land. And the speech, it's broken up into 3 large sections.
So Moses begins the first part of the speech with a somber tone because he's highlighting Israel's rebellion and resistance, which has been going on for the last 40 years.
And that sets up the rest of this opening section, which is Moses' challenge to this new generation to be different from their parents and to respond to God's grace with love and obedience. So he reminds them of the 10 Commandments, like the basics of the covenant, and then he gives them this very famous line.
Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
Now, in Jewish tradition, this is called the Shema, because the first Hebrew word in this line is Shema Yisrael. And this became a very important prayer in Judaism, said twice a day. And it emphasizes the Israelites' exclusive commitment to their God, the one true God who loved them and who rescued them from slavery.
Right, because they're about to go into a land where people are worshiping many other gods.
And Moses thinks that loyalty to the Lord their God is the only way to life. Now, notice these key words in the Shema: listen and love. You're going to find these words all over this opening section of the speech. The word listen in Hebrew means more than just let sound waves come into your ears. It includes the idea of responding to what you hear. So for Israel, this means responding to God's grace by obeying the laws of the covenant.
And then listen is always followed by love.
Yeah, so love is the true motivation for obeying the laws. Israel won't obey without love, and they don't truly love if they don't obey. So there's this tight connection between loving and listening that runs through the entire book. And so Moses tells them that if they do listen and love, they will fulfill their original calling as the family of Abraham, to show all of the nations the wisdom and justice of God, and so become a blessing to them.
The second big section in Deuteronomy is a large block of laws and commands.
And this is where the book gets its name. Deuteronomy means a second law. And it's because many of these laws we've heard before. In fact, in the first line of the book, we're told that Moses is here explaining, clarifying the laws. So he's repeating and expanding on the laws, making them relevant to this new generation.
There's laws about how Israel is to worship God, laws about their leadership structure, laws about social justice, and then some more laws about their worship.
Now, after all of the laws, Moses warns Israel of the consequences of their obedience or disobedience, or in his words, the blessing or the curse. If they listen and love, they will experience blessing and abundance in the land. And if they don't, there's going to be famine and plagues, and they'll be forced off their land into exile.
And that brings us to the final section of his speech.
Yeah, here Moses says, I set before you today life or death, blessing or curse. So choose life. But then things get really interesting, because after 40 years with these people, Moses knows they're not going to obey. And so he predicts their failure and even their future exile from the promised land. And he focuses on what he thinks is the true source of the problem, that they have hard and selfish hearts. It's as if Israel is incapable of truly loving God in a way that brings about obedience.
But this problem isn't unique to Israel.
Yeah, in fact, Moses, when he's using this language about blessing and curse, he's tying Israel's story all the way back to all of humanity's story from Genesis 1 through 3.
So Adam and Eve, they were blessed by God, just like Israel, and given a choice to trust and obey God, like Israel.
And then they rebelled and brought a curse on the land, like Moses knows Israel is going to do. And so these stories, they're about Israel's hard heart, but they're actually a window into the universal human condition.
But Moses doesn't give up hope entirely.
That's right. He says that somehow, on the other side of Israel's exile, God promises to transform their hearts so that one day they truly can listen and love.
In the final chapters, Joshua is appointed as the new leader of Israel.
And then Moses takes the entire law code,
The one he just predicted Israel would break.
that's right, and he puts it into the Ark of the Covenant. And then Moses hikes up to the top of a mountain so he can see the promised land from afar, and then he dies. And that's how the Torah ends.
Which is a strange place to end the story. It's right there at the climax. Will they obey the laws and live faithfully in the land or not?
Well, the story does continue right into Joshua, the next book of the Bible. But this is the end of the Torah, and it's been ended here for a reason. The Torah is written for people who are either outside of the land or who are still waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise to bless the whole world. And so now, as each generation reads the Torah, they find themselves called to hope in what Moses hoped for, a new, transformed heart that one day can truly listen and love. Hey, guys.
So I really liked and appreciated in that video, they started the story, they went back and kind of said, we can't understand Deuteronomy unless we understand the story up to this point. But then they started from Egypt, which I thought was really kind of cool, because we talked about last week how, and the week before, we were sort of been developing this idea the whole time about Genesis being the sort of prequel, and the story begins there in Exodus and the redemption of Israel out of Egypt. So I thought that was really neat. So the Torah, I just want to kind of bring up something they said there at the end, is written to people in exile who are awaiting to see the fulfillment of the promises of God. And so how do we, as modern Christians, read and understand the Torah? Because we like to do it either one of two ways. And I'm convinced that these two ways exist on two ends of a spectrum. We either like to do it legalistically. We read the Torah and we feel this condemnation in all the ways that we fall short of the perfection in which God revealed himself through the law. Or we start by reading Romans 6:14 and reminding ourselves that we are not under the law, we're under grace, and we read it in this sort of antinomianism type of like, none of this applies to me kind of way. And it's either super legalistic or it's just super like throw the laws out. And that generally, in my experience, has been kind of how the church applies the Torah to modern believers. But if we take what I think is the literary purpose of the Torah, as they talked about in the video, it's for people who are in exile, waiting to see the future promises of God. Like, that's you and me, right? Like, you and me are living in a world outside of the presence of God, and we have this future promise of this new creation and this promised land that God is going to make for us and bring us into. And the Torah is kind of like this guidebook of how we ought to live outside of that and what we're looking forward to. And I think for me, that just adds like so much weight to the importance of understanding the Torah and reading the Torah and what it can do for us as modern Christians. I think that's pretty cool. I can tell tonight is going to be one of those nights where I really have to pull you guys into the conversation with me. But that's okay. It happens. We've had a few of those now, and we'll have a few more before the end. So, we read Deuteronomy chapter 7 through chapter 12. And the end of chapter 11, if we want to break up the book into the three sections that the Bible Project uses to break up the book, and at the end of chapter 11, we're going to come to the end of the first section, which is sort of that story so far, what did they call it in the video last week? The sermons of Moses to the second generation of Israel. And in chapter 12, we're going to start entering into the second time the law is given. It won't be so boring, I hope. We've been through a lot of it already. It'll be fun. So here's how chapter 7 starts. Everybody ready? It says, when Yahweh, your Elohim, brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when Yahweh your Elohim gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. And you guys who know the biblical story, did they do that? Did they do what God says? Nope, they make a covenant, they show mercy, all those things. He says, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. Can you imagine a recent event in Israel's history that Moses probably has on his mind as he's saying that?
Yeah, his marriage.
Yep.
Balaam.
Yeah. Baal at Peor.
Peor.
At Peor. Yeah, I knew you were thinking of the right thing. You just couldn't get the
When you
words.
first asked, I thought you meant like recent for today.
Oh, no, I meant from Moses' perspective. I can think of probably plenty for today. Maybe not intermarriage specifically, but bad stuff. 4, here's why. Why not intermarry? Here's why. 4, they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other Elohim. Then the anger of Yahweh would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall break down their altars, and dash in pieces their pillars, and chop down their Asherim, and burn their carved images with fire. Because you are a people holy to Yahweh, your Elohim. Yahweh, your Elohim, has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And here's why. Not because you are more in number than any of the people that Yahweh set his love on you and chose you, for you are fewest of all peoples. But it is because Yahweh loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that Yahweh has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Why is God giving them the land, according to chapter 7? Because he loves them, and because he promised it and made a covenant with their fathers. Okay. Know therefore that Yahweh, your Elohim, is Elohim, the faithful El, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations. What's that sound like? Yeah, in what was it, Exodus 34, yeah. Everyone can talk, it doesn't just have to be my parents.
Just helping you out.
Thanks. Verse 10, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. As I was reading that this afternoon, kind of preparing myself for tonight, I was thinking about the line, I think it comes up in Hebrews, I'm pretty sure it comes up in Malachi, where he says, Jacob I've loved and Esau I've hated. Right? And it's always one of those things that I think at first glance it doesn't really sit right with us, because we're like, why would God choose to love one and hate the other? Like, hate isn't really language that we associate very often with God. It doesn't fit what we like to think of as his character. I think that tonight sort of sheds a little bit of light on why he might say that about Esau, as well as what's happening to the 7 nations that he's taking out of the land before Israel. He says, he will not be slack with one who hates him. He will repay him to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandment and the statutes and the rules that I obey you today. And because you listen to these rules and keep and do them, Yahweh, your Elohim, will keep with you the covenant and the steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. He will love you, bless you, and multiply you. And where's that multiplication first time that comes up? Where we stand before Genesis 1. Yeah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. So God is going to do the thing that he commanded Adam and Eve to do as a result of Israel keeping the covenant. He will also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, your grain and your wine and your oil, the increase of your herds and the young of your flock in the land that he swore to your fathers to give to you. You shall be blessed above all peoples. There shall not be male or female barren among you, or among your livestock. And Yahweh will take away from you all sickness, and none of the evil diseases of Egypt which you knew will he inflict on you. But he will lay them on all who hate you. And you shall consume all the peoples that Yahweh your Elohim will give over to you. Your eye shall not pity them, neither shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. So, if they're obedient, God gives them blessing. Pretty simple. All right. You've heard me say it probably a few too many times by now. He says, if you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what Yahweh your Elohim did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. So what's the evidence that God gives them so that they can know that they're going to have victory over people who are greater than them? Well, he's already done it. Egypt was greater than you, and I took you out of there, and they all died in the Red Sea. Then he says, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, and the outstretched arm by which Yahweh your Elohim brought you out, so will Yahweh your Elohim do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. What I did to Egypt at the beginning of this story, I'm going to do to these nations in the Promised Land at the end of the story. It's a chiasm of death. Moreover, Yahweh your God, your Elohim, will send hornets among them until those who are left and hide themselves from you are destroyed. You shall not be in dread of them, for Yahweh your Elohim is in your midst, a great and awesome Elohim. Yahweh your Elohim will clear away these nations before you little by little. You may not make an end to them all at once, lest the wild beasts grow too numerous for you. I really love that line there in verse 22, because had God not told us that, as we read the story and things are progressing very slowly, and especially for those who are in the story, it might seem as though God wasn't really keeping his promises in the way that he said he would. But in fact, it's his provision that they would take them out slowly, because otherwise the land would fight back against them instead of just the people. I've always I've really liked that line of why he's not going to do it all at once. He says, but Yahweh, your God, will give them over to you and throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed, and he will give their kings into your hand, and you shall make their name perish from under heaven. No one shall be able to stand against you until you have destroyed them. The carved images of their Elohim you shall burn with fire. You shall not covet the silver or the gold that is on them to take it for yourselves, lest you be ensnared by it, for it is an abomination to Yahweh your Elohim. So we've talked about that Joshua 6 story with Achan taking the gold from the ruins of Jericho, which was all supposed to be devoted to destruction. God says that what he took was an abomination. And it says here, and you shall not bring an abominable thing into your house and become devoted to destruction like it. You shall utterly detest and abhor it, for it is devoted to destruction. So, if you take the things that are devoted to destruction, Israel, you will become the thing devoted to destruction. And that's exactly what happens in the story of Achan. So there you go. That's chapter 7. This is important. What is supposed to happen to that, the thing, if you are disobedient, will happen to you. And the reason why that's important is because the same thing applies to those 7 nations as we're going to keep going. If Israel is disobedient, what's supposed to happen to those nations is going to happen to Israel. I think that's really, it's going to become an important point as we push forward tonight. So, any questions on chapter 7? Chapter 7 is pretty simple, especially it's just that blessing for obedience, cursing for disobedience. If you're good, it's all going to work out. Keep the covenant, follow God's law. And if you don't follow God's law, if you don't keep the covenant, you're going to become devoted to destruction. It's pretty simple. It's like a condensed version of Deuteronomy 28, which we'll get to in a couple weeks. So, chapter 8 here. We're not going to read the whole thing like chapter 7. I'm going to start skipping some parts. So if I skip something you want to talk about, just stop me. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do. Basically the same as the last chapter. That you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that Yahweh swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that Yahweh, your Elohim, has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So what was the purpose of the 40 years in the wilderness? To humble them and to test them. Wait, I thought it was punishment for being afraid of the giants, the sons of the Anakim, instead of going and taking the land. That was for their parents. So I'm looking at this going, well, this is both. And I think we've talked a little bit before about God's motivations for doing things, especially when we got to the golden calf incident. We talked about whether or not God changes his mind, and we had all these deep theological conversations that I felt like were very meaningful. I tend to feel like we boil God down to a very simplistic being. I certainly do it a lot, because especially through the Torah, it seems like, generally speaking, he is pretty simplistic. He's like, if you're obedient, I'll bless you. If you're disobedient, I'll curse you. That's an and or gate in a logic circuit. There's nothing hard to understand about that. God is super simple. If you do this, I'll do this. If you do that, I'll do that. But I think this is one of those times where I'm reminded that, well, it's fine to think about God as being outside of time. I'm totally down with that. God reveals himself in a story that takes place in human history. So his revelation is progressive, and his character is revealed through this progressive story. And throughout that progressive story, he seems just as complex I'm going to say person. I know God's not a person, but he's a personal God, so I'm comfortable saying person. He seems as complex a person as every other character in the story is complex. And so this is one of those times where I'm just sort of reminded, oh yeah, God can do something for more than one reason. as simple as that conclusion sounds, how often do we just sort of pass over that and make God into and or gate in a logic circuit? If I'm good, God's going to be good. But yeah, there you go. Anyway, that's what I thought about as I was doing this. Here's something fun. Verse 3. He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but lives by every word that comes out of the mouth of Yahweh. And where do you see that quoted in the New Testament? Yeah, Jesus to the devil or Satan. I forget how Matthew 4 says it, but Matthew 4, Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 8:3 when Satan tries to use scripture against him. Jesus is the Word who becomes flesh, so if you're going to try to use the Bible against anyone, it probably shouldn't be. Anyways. Yeah. Oh gosh, yes, totally. The whole wilderness story of Jesus. Oh, I don't have time to get into this. The whole wilderness story of Jesus. All the temptations that he faces, parallel temptations of the nation of Israel in the wilderness. It's really, really cool to look at.
Yeah, he was there for 40 days.
40 days instead of 40. Yeah, totally. Exactly. Okay, so he says, when you were hungry, I gave you manna. So food. Okay. Verse 4, your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. So they had food, and they had clothing, miraculously. Your clothes don't last 40 years, right? I got to go to Walmart and replace jeans every couple months. Like, they just don't last that long, okay? But clothes lasted 40 years in the wilderness. I want to jump down real quick just to kind of tie all this together to verse 15. And verse 15 says, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness where there's fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water? Who brought you water out of the flinty rock? And then 16 brings up the manna again. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know? So, in this chapter, what I think is one of the things being developed, and I'm being a little bit reductionist here because there's a lot going on in this chapter, but it's really cool to see how in this chapter, the things that God provided for Israel were what to eat, what to drink, and what to wear. Does that ring a bell for you?
Yeah.
What is it?
Seek ye first the kingdom of God.
Okay, so let's jump over to Matthew chapter 6.
Do not worry what you will eat,
Uh-huh.
what you will wear.
Why are you anxious about clothing? He says, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So, I think that this verse is oftentimes a little bit misapplied. What things will be added to you?
What you need.
Specifically,
Clothing.
clothing, food, and water. Clothing, food, and water. I think that God is a really good father, and any good father wants their kid to have things that they want and not just things that they need. Nonetheless, Matthew 6 is about what we eat, drink, and wear. And Jesus is pulling Matthew 6 straight out of Deuteronomy 8. And he's looking at this time of Israel in the wilderness going, these are the things that God provides for Israel. And you, now about to be under this new covenant inaugurated through the blood of Jesus, do you think that God's not going to do the same thing for you that he did for Israel? I think that gives us a little glimpse into how to use the mirror of the law, because Hebrews says it's the shadow of things to come, right? So it gives us that little glimpse into how do we actually today, how do you and me use the law? And if God does something for Israel, it's pretty dumb to think that he won't do it for us too. And I think that gives us sort of how Jesus is using the law, which makes me pretty confident to use it in a similar way if Jesus did it.
Also kind of ties us into grafting
Of Romans 11, yeah. Being grafted into the, I forget what kind of tree it was, but into the tree. Probably olive. It's always olive. So there you go, Matthew 6. Really, really cool. Let me jump down to verse 17. Verse 17. Going almost to the bottom here. Beware, lest you say in your heart. Okay, hold on. I want to jump up and get the context here. Okay, so take care lest you forget Yahweh your Elohim by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes which I command you today. Verse 12. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up and you forget Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness. What's the idea going on here?
worse things for belief and faith is success.
Is success, is prosperity, yeah. And one of the best things for it, if you just follow the logic, There's a reason why the church flourishes under persecution. And I don't think it's a coincidence. Let's pick up in 16. Who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do good in the end. Beware, lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Who's that remind you of? He's not an Israelite, but I can tell you who it reminds me of. Nebuchadnezzar. When he's standing on the wall of Babylon and goes, look at how great this kingdom is that I've built. And what happens to him?
Yeah,
He becomes a beast for 7 years and eats grass and his fingernails grow all long. It's pretty cool.
Babel, the original Tower of Babel, too?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, because Nebuchadnezzar is just like a retelling of Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Love it. That's what I had in chapter 8. Anyone got anything? I'm going to move on. And keep going. I can't believe we're already a half hour in. It's like, goodness. Time goes so slow all day, and then I start teaching, and it's like, nope, you're done. Okay. So, we got the Anakim here in verse 2, and you know I can't skip over an opportunity to talk about Anakim. And then you go and dispossess the nations greater and mightier than you, great cities fortified up to heaven, people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, who you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? Know therefore today that he who goes before you as a consuming fire is Yahweh your Elohim. He will destroy and subdue them before you, so you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly, as Yahweh has promised you. Do not say in your heart, after Yahweh your Elohim has thrust them out before you. It is because of my righteousness that Yahweh has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is driving them out before you. Okay, that might not feel like a big deal. That's a big deal that we just read. Why is Israel, that's not how to ask that question. So it's not because Israel is righteous that they get the land, right? It's not because they're righteous. In fact, we're going to spend the whole rest of this chapter talking about how unrighteous Israel is, how bad they are, and how undeserving of the land they are. So why are they going to end up getting the land? Why are the nations before them being kicked out?
Every 400 years, because I have to let them fulfill their own wickedness.
Yeah. I was just going because they're wicked, but totally. It's Genesis, what was it, 14? Genesis 4? No, that's Melchizedek. Genesis 15? No, that's, anyway, it's one of those Genesis ones. The 400-year thing, that's a really good point. So if God is taking the nations out of the land because of wickedness, what passage of scripture am I going to go to here? Y'all know me. Y'all have been with me. It's cursings for disobedience. He's taking wicked nations and he's saying the thing in Leviticus 26 and the thing in Deuteronomy 28 that's given to the next generation. We haven't gotten there yet, but I've said it enough times. That same thing applies to them. And it's because of their wickedness. It's because of their not keeping the standard of God that they're going to be taken out of the land. So, the rest of Deuteronomy should be pretty logical. We can figure it out right now. What's going to happen to Israel if they live like the nations? They're also going to be taken out of the land. That's the book of Deuteronomy. It's the simplest thing ever to figure out. It's really, really easy. Go ahead.
Question. Isn't Israel physically situated as the closest place to Eden? Isn't it that the entrance to Eden being somewhere in that area and that being the place closest to being back in Eden? I mean, we kind of hit that theme as man was moved out of Eden into the area of the four rivers and into the Middle East. It just seems like that's kind of the closest place people can be to God. And if you follow that through, it's being lived in by people who have been wicked and don't deserve it. He's going to force them out and let his people come in, but under the condition that they uphold his law as well, or they'll be pulled out of that closeness to God. well.
If I take Eden to be, if I understand the literary symbolism and metaphor of what Eden is, I'm going to totally agree with you. When it comes to geographical location, Eden, it can't really be placed. Two of the rivers are over here, one of the rivers is down there, one of the rivers we don't know where it is. There's all sorts of scholarly debate about whether Eden itself was a metaphor. I tend to look at it as literal, but then you have to ask the question, well, where'd it go? Which is a fair question. I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
Our eyes are blinded.
Because
Yeah.
Adam and Eve were forced east
I guess.
into the Middle East, right? When they were removed from the garden, they were pushed to that area, and then they continued east from there.
Yeah, we don't know exactly where they went, and
Yeah, but what about the flood?
I don't know. I was just about to say any geography that existed in Adam and Eve's time was wiped out with the flood anyway, so that's a little bit hard to. Yeah. And then there's scholars out there, and you can find commentaries, and I think that they're really good, respectable guys, that they don't take a literary view of anything from Genesis, a literal view of anything in Genesis 1 through 11. So they're going to say Eden's a metaphor, flood's a metaphor, all this stuff's a metaphor. I don't lean that way, but
I'm just thinking the discussion we had about Abraham being told to go west,
yep.
right?
Yeah, the
To
theme
go
of
to the
East and
promised
West.
land. So, you know, if you kind of put that westward movement,
Yes.
being closer to God, you can't get any more west in the Middle East
Yeah.
than, you know, the Mediterranean.
Right.
So,
Yeah, no, you're totally right. It completely fits into that theme of East and West with, you know, Lot going east, and then Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden to the east, and then there's the west, or the tabernacle door is on the east, so going into the tabernacle, you're traveling west, out, you're traveling east. It's all this within the same theme. And as far as the theme goes, I am going to look at the Promised Land and Eden as one and the same when it comes to the theme. Geographically, I'm not going to make any statements about it because I don't think the Bible does. So I'm going to kind of have to pull back off that.
I was just thinking of all the warnings they've had about, you know, when you go into the land, you got to do this. If you don't, thus will happen. What a change would have happened if they would have said, I like the first statements, okay, we're earthlings, we're sharecroppers in the land, and it's going to have abundant rain in the fall and in the spring if we keep this. And we don't own this land, but we get to stay here if we're good sharecroppers. In
Yeah.
other words, obeying what the master says we're supposed to do in his land. That's all they had to do.
That's all they have to do.
I know, and it's just so frustrating. It's like,
But then again, all Adam had to do was not eat from one
I
tree.
know.
He didn't even do that.
It just seems that after 40 years, you would think there's a pattern of God we need to think about here.
Yeah,
They
you
don't
know.
think about his character. Like, there's a nevertheless. He said it, and it's going to happen.
Mhm.
And here's all the people and tribes and nations it's happened to, so you kind of get a pattern that why I'm driving them out, because it's my land, not yours, not theirs. You want to stay here, just do as I say.
Totally. And I think that
I don't know, it's just like, are you kidding me?
that train of thought is a modern meditation on the Torah. And I think that we have something to grab from exactly what you just said, which is this is showing us the character of God.
Right.
And if the character of God doesn't change,
Right.
then shouldn't, now, Romans 6:14, for sure, I don't want to be anti-law, right? But at the same time, I also understand that I don't have to keep the law because Jesus did. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't show me the character of God. It doesn't show me all these things. I see your hand. I'm going to come to you next. So in that pattern, go think back to the Shema. Hear, listen, obey, and then love. And then in that video we watched at the beginning, the motivation for obedience is love, and the motivation for love is obedience. And you find that God is good when you obey him and you love him more, and when you love him more, you obey him more. Well, this is the old covenant. So fast forward that to the new covenant. Is there anything like love and obedience in the new covenant? There most definitely is. Jesus said in the most plain terms he could say, if you love me, you'll keep my commands. So yeah, it's just a modern meditation on the Torah and how God's character is revealed to us. Yeah.
So I think not only do we get a good glimpse of who God is in this, but he really outlines what humans are.
Totally.
In how we, don't think in your heart this. I know that's what you're going to do. And that's
Yeah.
what we do every time.
Yeah.
It's our pride gets in the way and we start thinking that we can do it on our own.
Yeah.
And that's what Adam did all
Yeah.
the way through.
And I mean, if you look at, I think it's Jeremiah 31, or it might be Ezekiel 36, I forget which one says which, but God talks about how in the Old Covenant, the law was written with a pen made
Stone.
of diamond to write on stone. But in the New Covenant, he's going to write with his finger on our hearts. And it's like the law is no longer this external thing that sits in a tabernacle. The law in the New Covenant becomes an internal thing, which I think is really, really neat. Who else had their hand up? Was it you?
Yeah.
Oh, I see you too.
Going back to the whole, do not think in your heart that you were right, that you were given this land. Like, it boils down to they didn't have to do anything to get that land. They didn't do a single thing. They were disobedient and they got the land. All because of the promise to God. They didn't keep the law, even though the law was there. And it reminds me somehow in a weird parallel, like, Paul said, I think, and I can't remember exactly where he was like, does that mean that we can sin? And he says, certainly not. That
Should we continue sinning that grace may abound?
Yeah.
Certainly not,
And
yeah.
it's so funny because this is exactly what they were doing.
Yeah. So let me throw this at you. They did have to do something. They had to have enough faith to cross a dried up river.
They had to accept it, yeah.
I suppose.
You suppose.
I mean,
Because crossing the river, I'm going to equate to, I'm going to parallel to baptism, right? So they had to have enough faith to cross the river.
to step foot in it before it was dry, I think is what it said, right?
You're right. Totally.
But they also had to have enough faith to understand what Moses has laid out, because going into the land, these people were not in Egypt.
Yeah.
So they did not experience the slavery and the stories that are told. Much like today, we're going back and we read the story of Jesus, his birth, his death, his resurrection. We have to have the faith to follow in that salvation.
To believe it.
If we're willing to receive it. So there's,
Yeah.
I see the parallel.
Yeah. So theologians are going to pick up on the discussion that we're having now and ask the question, so is faith a work?
Yeah.
I'm going to leave that for y'all to debate in your own minds. But where if you take a theology class, you're going to have this discussion, and then the professor's going to hit you with that, and then you just got to keep going. I'm going to cut us off with that instead of keeping us going. Yeah.
I was going to say, this is one of the things that really sets the Bible apart, or Israel apart from other cultures. Because even when we get into the eras of the kings, instead of being like, my dad's a god, or I'm a god, or whatever, which was used to justify just unlimited ultimate power.
Right.
God, I put you there, I can take you out, and God limits their power. It's, you better not start doing stuff you shouldn't be doing, or I'm going to take you out.
Yeah, totally. In Egypt, that was the practice. Like, you got to be a pharaoh. Like, the view of a pharaoh was that you were essentially half God. How that plays into this whole Anak and Nephilim thing, I'm not sure. But the idea is, like, you are a God man. That was who a pharaoh was. And the only way to become a pharaoh was to either be the son of a God man, so that you also were, or to kill the one who's in power now to prove that you also are. And so you have this whole line of like pharaohs it's exactly what you're saying. It's like you had to be divine in order to express some level of authority. And that's what God's going against, is like, you're not divine, I am.
Boy, did the English mess that up.
What?
Boy, did the English mess that up.
Oh, yeah.
If they're anointed, well, it's not just the English, the French, all of them.
Pretty much every monarchy in
Yeah.
history kind of messed it
Yeah.
up along the way. Well, pretty much any government structure, no matter what it was, run by man, kind of messed it up along the way. All right, where am I here? Chapter 9, we talked about that. And Southern Israelites. Okay, so from verse 6 on to the end, verse 6 says, "Know therefore that Yahweh your Elohim is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are stubborn people. Remember how you provoked the Lord in the wilderness from the day you came out of Egypt." And he just goes back through the story again, and he talks all about how Israel is not good enough to inherit the land. They're stubborn, they're unrighteous, they're like, it's not because of their righteousness that they get to possess the land. Even the golden calf incident, he brings it up again. He says here in verse 27, towards the end of chapter 9, he says, "Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not regard," this is, I believe this is when Moses was talking to God.
I prayed to the Lord.
Yes, 26, "I prayed to the Lord." So 27, Moses is talking to God. "Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do not regard the stubbornness of this people, or their wickedness, or their sin, lest the land from which you brought us," that's Egypt, "say, because Yahweh was not able to bring them into the land that he promised them, and because he hated them, he has brought them out to put them to death in the wilderness." So what is Moses' argument to God about
Don't break your promise.
don't break your promise?
Ruin your reputation.
It'll ruin your reputation. It has to do with how are the other nations, especially Egypt, going to look at you if we all die in the wilderness? And what they would say about Yahweh is he's not the most powerful God. He couldn't even deliver his people to the promised land. And he saved a bunch of people that he hated anyways. So, like, if God's motivation is for everyone in the world to understand who he is, like he says to Pharaoh, "Then you will know that I am Yahweh," then Moses is like, well, you have to bring them into the promised land so that they get what you're trying, otherwise they won't understand the message. So there you go. I love that. It brings us back to that idea of the evangelistic element of the Torah. It was never about one nation. It was always about making one nation into priests to reach every nation, which I think is just so mixed.
Real quick before you move on, Deuteronomy 9.
Yep.
Just an awesome parallel to the state of Christians before they accept the Lord.
Explain what you mean.
Well, he's talking about how terrible and undeserving and stubborn and so forth the Israelites were, and yet they're going to get what God promised them because God promised them. And it's not because of their own righteousness that they're going to get it. And then you parallel that to the status before salvation of people who come to salvation.
There you go.
John, I know it's not your viewpoint, but you mentioned having conversations with people that the law doesn't apply to Gentiles. What is their argument for that, given that, he's destroying them for their own wickedness and things like that? Like, what is the definition if not it's by the law? What is their argument that it doesn't apply to Gentiles?
I don't remember the verse. So basically Romans 2:12 to somewhere. For all who have sinned without the law also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law. So that is, it's a statement that's hard to argue with. But I don't think that Paul's making the statement that the law doesn't apply to them, just that they don't know it. He says, when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. And I think what that's speaking of is something that we call general revelation, where we understand the law just by virtue of being little versions of God. Like just the fact that I exist and breathe should tell me something about the fact that I can't come from nothing. And so I should understand that there is a God. That's general revelation, okay? Even though they don't have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Well, their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. So that's the one that I have had. I think you're referring to my story of when I was berated in a coffee shop. That was what they took me to.
Wait, what? You were berated in a coffee shop?
For teaching
Right.
that if the law doesn't apply to Gentiles, then why do we need Jesus to fulfill it for us to be saved? It's kind of the crux of what I taught. And I was taken to a coffee shop and shown in no uncertain terms why I was wrong. And they don't go here anymore.
Or people used to take you like Galatians or something if they wanted.
That's another spot. Any of these, like Paul's theses on the law, Romans and Galatians, these are all places where people will kind of bring you to and be like, no, the law was for Israel and all these things, but it's like, I don't think that you can study the Torah and arrive at that conclusion. I think you can study the New Testament, and if you study it exclusively and maybe even primarily, you might get there, but I don't think that's really a full understanding of Scripture. So, does that answer?
Yeah, no, I mean, it does, because as we're reading through the Torah, I'm like, how in the world could you make that claim that it doesn't apply when these nations are being wiped out because they're not following the law?
And that's how I feel. But unless you start from Genesis 1 and end in Deuteronomy, it's really like, it's hard to make that case to someone who's like, it says Gentiles don't have the law. It's like, hold on. I got to start way further back than this. And it's really hard to just have that discussion. And this is why I think something like this is just so crucial that the church actually kind of get a grip with the Torah a little bit. I think we're really missing that. So here we are, so that we're not. So chapter 10. I'm going to really jump across chapter 10 very quickly. Verses 1 through 11 is more history overview. Okay? Any questions on that? Cool. Verse 16 is where I want to go. Let's get the context from 14. Behold, to Yahweh, your Elohim, belong heaven. Oh, I love this verse. Belong heaven and the heaven of heavens, the earth with all that is in it. So who owns the earth?
Well, Satan has the deed at the moment.
He's acting like
Well, he has the deed.
What do you mean the deed?
Not the deed, no, I'd say he's the operating agreement.
He's a squatter. He's a rent squatter.
I like that, he's just renting.
He's a squatter.
Yeah, he doesn't have any
What do you mean
ownership.
the deed?
Heavens and earth, heavens belong to
No, he's the operator.
He's the prince of the air. In Adam and Eve's sin,
Mhm.
they gave up the right of ownership in the sense of a contract in ancient Judaism, where a land deed, if you took out a loan on it, you owed something for it, would be sealed with the requirements for you to get it back to be redeemed.
The title deed to the
And
earth.
Jesus fulfilled that, which I think when we get to Revelation and we see the scroll with the 7 seals, he's reasserting his ownership, his final ownership of it. But in the meantime, I think Satan has some control over what goes on here on earth.
I'm going to agree with your last statement. I also think Satan has some control over what's going on here on earth.
Pastor Matt teaches this, so be careful.
I know, that's why I'm like, no, I don't want to just.
That's a metaphor anyway.
It is a metaphor. So here's where I'm going to go with this. There are 3 things in the Bible that are written on the front and back. The first one is, sorry, there's 4 things. The first one, you're right. The first one is the tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments. They were written on the front and back. The second one is the scroll in Daniel. The third one is the scroll in Zechariah, which is flying through the air. And on one side, I'm going to paraphrase this incorrectly, it casts out all of those who worship idols, and on the other side, all of those who steal. I think it's those 2, but it's something from the first 4 on one side and the last 6 on the other of the 10 Commandments. So I'm going to conclude it's the law. And then in Revelation, you get the scroll written on the front and back. Matt's going to argue that that's the title deed to earth. I'm okay with that. I'm not going to be like dogmatic against it, but I am going to disagree a little bit because the other 3, I think, when you see the stone tablets, the scroll in Daniel and the scroll in Zechariah, those to me appear to be the law. One being the 10 Commandments, the other is casting out people according to the 10 Commandments. It's all about judgment on people who break the law. The scroll in Revelation, chapter 6, with the 7 seals, that's written on both sides. The only person who can open it is the Lamb, because the Lamb is the one who conquered. So I'm going to argue that that scroll, that what's being opened at the breaking of the 7 seals, is the law. Because
Then that would have to be the book, or the books that are open in judgment.
yes,
Okay.
but Revelation's all metaphorical, so the book and that can do the same thing. No one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open it. No one else has ever kept the law. They don't have the right to be able to open it, but the Lamb has conquered. To me, I can't really see anything else that makes sense. So I'm not really going to grab onto that title deed of earth language, but I think it's good. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I wouldn't even enter into a conversation with Matt about it. It's not something I'm dogmatic about. But I'm like, who owns the earth?
It belongs to the Lord
Creator,
God.
alongside the Lord.
He owns everything.
And so you have Satan, who's this fallen angel who goes about like a roaring lion, definitely has some power, some authority. Otherwise, we wouldn't be battling against it. We don't wage war against, we wage war against principalities and powers, however that verse goes. So Petra, you had your hand up, and then Rachel, you had your hand up.
I totally get how you would be like, if these 3 things are alike, the 4th should be as well, but the 3 things, the first 3 happened in the Old Testament, and the 4th one was after Jesus already fulfilled the law. So I don't quite, I want to understand and kind of get where you're at, but why would he even be bringing the law forward? He didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill it, and it was already fulfilled. So why even have that? Why would that, to me, that just doesn't seem like
That's a great question. I'm going to say because. I think this is a good answer, so I'm going to start it with because. When the scroll is being opened, who is it being opened in order to bring judgment upon? When the scroll in Revelation is being opened, the seals are being broken, who is it being opened in order to bring judgment upon?
Everyone.
People who didn't fulfill it or believe in Jesus to have it fulfilled on their behalf.
right? But
Nobody fulfilled, but Jesus did on behalf of people who believe in him.
So it's to judge those that do not.
It's to judge people who the law has not been fulfilled for. So you make a really good point, but
the law, who the law was not given
Yeah.
by Jesus for. I see what you're saying.
there you go. There you go. My goodness, time's flying.
Week 5.
Somebody take his
note that, especially the time of the conversation, a lot of people take it from when Adam and Eve sinned, but it's important that when God confronted them and confronted the serpent,
That's a good point.
enmity first.
Yeah.
And from my understanding, Satan's fall or Lucifer's fall was being cast out, exiled, not given a place to rule.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick up on that, and I'm going to make one other point on this. The thing that humanity was supposed to do, or the things, was to be a king and to be a priest. And in the history of Israel, we already have the institution of the priesthood. And when we get into Samuel, we're going to get the institution of the royal line of David. So neither of the two things that God established for Adam and Eve to do were taken and given to Satan.
Doesn't it say somewhere, John? I always thought it said that that dominion was given to Satan over the earth. Is that not scriptural?
I can't think of exactly where it would say that. Let's look it up after class together. Because I don't want to just cut this conversation off, but we really need to. Okay, cool. Okay, so that conversation was actually going somewhere totally different. Where even was I? What verse was that? Oh, verse 14. Yeah, I was giving just, we didn't even get close. Okay. Yet Yahweh set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them. You above all peoples, as you are this day, circumcise therefore the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. For Yahweh, your Elohim, is Elohim of Elohim, and Adon of Adoni, Lord of lords, but not Lord Yahweh, Lord Adonai. The great, the mighty, the awesome Elohim, who is not partial and takes no bribe. He executes justice, and he goes on to talk about social justice and God's heart for widows and sojourners and all that. What I want to look at there is verse 16, because circumcision was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. It's not the sign of the Mosaic covenant. So what's going on here? What are we being told?
I think it's like the first step towards what Jesus will do with writing on your heart. He's, it's not a matter of doing something physical to your body. You have to do it to your soul.
I 100% agree. So should we read this verse literally?
It sounds.
Yeah, right?
But wasn't Abraham tied to faith?
Yeah, he believed and God counted to him as righteousness.
So if it's saying, be no longer stubborn, do like Abraham, have faith.
And the sign of your relationship with God is not going to be external forever, is how I'm going to take that. But the sign of your relationship with God is going to become something that's internal. Are you guys with me? I feel like I lost some people when I kind of argued with something that's one of Matt's pet topics. Okay. I just want to be clear, I'm cool with the title deed to earth. I might not draw the same conclusion, but we don't have to. Right? Okay, cool. And the same goes for you guys. You're welcome to disagree with me. Right? Everyone happy? Okay, great. All right, good. I just felt like the whole air in the room changed, so I wanted to just... all right, chapter 11. So this is great. This is the last part of Moses' sermons to Israel before he's going to get into the second giving of the actual laws themselves, starting in chapter 12. So chapter 11, you shall therefore love Yahweh your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, his commandments always, and consider today, since I'm not speaking to your children who have not known or seen it. So what's that mean about these people? They have known and seen it.
Yeah, they were little.
They were little,
Children.
but they were there. They were at Sinai. They saw miracles. They saw God's victory over, who were those two kings? Sihon and Og, yeah, that's it. You actually said it the more Hebrew way, so. Consider the discipline of Yahweh, your God. We don't like that. Consider the discipline. So, his greatness, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds that he did in Egypt to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and to all his land, And to the army of Egypt, to the horses and chariots, he made the water of the Red Sea flow over them as they pursued after you, and how Yahweh destroyed them to this day. And then he goes on, this is a long sentence. What he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place, and what he did to Dathan and Abiram. You remember who those two guys are?
Earth swallowed them up.
Yeah, in the rebellion of
Korah.
Korah, thank you. And how the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households, their tents, every living thing that followed them in the midst of Israel. All of that was discipline. It was discipline, and it was a display of his greatness and his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. I don't often think of Pharaoh as being disciplined.
Yeah.
Right?
That's cool.
But seeing what happened to Pharaoh could be discipline for Israel to learn from someone else's mistake and see the judgment of God come on someone else, and to know that this, because the point of discipline, I think we kind of lose it because we think about external discipline and then we have internal disciplines, and we never really talk about those two things together. That the purpose of external discipline is to instill internal discipline and self-discipline in a kid, whether it's church discipline, whether it's disciplining your child, whether it's swatting their hand away from a stove. Like, the reason you swat a kid's hand away from a stove is so they don't grab a stove when they're an adult, right? And so it's like the idea of the discipline that God is showing to Israel is so that Israel would have discipline in themselves. Why do they need that? Because they're stubborn. Because what happens if they don't have discipline and they don't keep the law? They're going to get discipline. If you don't have discipline, you're going to get discipline. It's another way to think about Deuteronomy 28, the cursing for disobedience. God is going to discipline you. And so that, the idea is not so that you're just out of my presence forever and we're forever separated. The idea is so that I'm going to bring you back and you're going to be better than you were before. And you get all those post-exilic history and prophets and stuff, and they're still human and mess up them too. So, discipline, love it. Also, this is cool. Look at the external examples used here. None of these are good examples of what you should do. All of these are bad examples of what you shouldn't do. You have Pharaoh and Dathan and Abiram. And then the next argument he goes into is, you shall therefore, because of what I just talked about above, keep the whole commandment that I command you today and be strong and go and take possession of the land. So because of that, therefore, you're looking at what happens above, and I'm concluding, if they don't keep the whole commandment and the whole commandment that I command you today and be strong and go in and take possession of the land, what's going to happen to them? They're going to be like Pharaoh and Dathan and Abiram. Deuteronomy's easy. After chapter 15, you really don't even need a teacher. It all just sort of teaches itself once you get the themes down. It's super easy.
What do you make of commandments being singular instead of plural? What is plural so much elsewhere?
Thank you for asking that. We're gonna. Ooh, that's so good. Okay. Where was that?
Verse 8.
No, this is a different thing. Thank you, though. Okay. We're going to talk about that in chapter 12. Yeah, and it's a great point, and you're totally right to ask it. We're going to get there. Okay. This is 8 through 12. Okay. So, if you don't want to be like Pharaoh and Dathan and Abiram, you keep the commandment. You may live long in the land. You remember that phrase, live long in the land? What's that coming from? Don't remember? It's the 5th of the 10 commandments. Honor your father and mother, and you'll live long in the land. Well, why is it taken out of the 5th commandment and now applied to the whole commandment? Because it applies to all of them. If you don't keep the whole commandment, James says if you keep the whole law and you stumble in one, you're guilty of the whole thing. So what happens if Israel keeps every sacrifice, every feast, every moed, every whatever they have to keep, all the sexual laws, all the family laws, they build parapets on their roof so that no one falls off, and then they cut the corners of their beard and their hair. What happens? They ruin it. They get kicked out of the land. Because if you stumble in one, you're guilty of all. If you stumble in the least of them, you're guilty of the whole law. That's what James says. So, yeah, there you go. Great. Cool. We really live long in the land. Okay, that Yahweh swore to your fathers to give them and to their offspring a land flowing with milk and honey. For the land that you are entering to take possession of it is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and irrigated it, like a garden of vegetables. But the land that you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, a land that Yahweh your Elohim cares for. The eyes of Yahweh your Elohim are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And if you will indeed obey my commandments, there it is, plural, that I command you today, to love Yahweh your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain, your wine and your oil, and he will give grass in your fields for livestock, and you shall eat and be full. What's that? It's, if you keep the law, I'm going to bless you. Okay. Verse 16, take care, lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. Then the anger of Yahweh will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that Yahweh is giving you. What's that? Cursing for disobedience. Deuteronomy is so easy. And so he says, lay up these words in your heart, in your soul, bind them as a sign on your hand, put them on the front lip between your eyes. I don't think I'm going to get that tattoo anytime soon. I think I'm good with that one. You shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise, and you write them on the mezuzot of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land that Yahweh swore to your fathers to give to them. It's like this repetition of Deuteronomy 6, all the language there in Deuteronomy 6, and now it's being applied into this covenant language. If you keep it, I'm going to bless you. It's like, we've read this all before by now. We come down to this weird thing. Okay. Verse 26. I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. So now he's just like, I'm going to make this as explicit as I can, just in case you missed it. I'm going to cover it again. Circle back. I'm setting before you a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I command you today. And the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, but turn aside from the way that I'm commanding you today to go after other gods that you have not known. And when Yahweh... Okay, wait a minute. So what is the disobedience, specifically? Worshipping other gods. Okay. And when Yahweh, your Elohim, brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim, and the curse on Mount Ebal. Are they not beyond the Jordan, west of the road, toward the going down of the sun, in the land of the Canaanites who live in the Arabah, opposite Gilgal, beside the oak or terebinth of Moreh? For you are to cross over the Jordan to go in to take possession of that land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you, and when you possess it and live in it, you shall be careful to do all the statutes and the rules that I'm setting before you today. Gerizim and Ebal is kind of a weird ritual where we're going to talk about it when we get into chapter 27. It's weird. 6 tribes go up on the one mountain, 6 tribes go up onto the other mountain, and then the Levites start screaming across the mountains. And everyone, the whole nation is like, yeah, we're going to do everything that Yahweh's spoken. And the Levites are like, if you don't, you're cursed. And they're like, yeah, we're going to. And you all know the story. They don't. Okay, hold on a second. I got to look this up. Okay, so. Okay. Here it is again. In chapter 8, we already hit it. It was a singular commandment instead of commandments. And then
When he says the whole commandment,
The whole
does that
commandment.
not make it a consummation of multiple commandments?
now that's one way to look at it, for sure.
Yeah, my Bible says every commandment.
Every commandment. That's so I guess my question is, what is the commandment that's given here that we covered? That was not just like just another set of laws or whatever. That's where I'm going. So, he said, don't worship other gods. Don't worship other gods. So, yeah, I'm going to tie that in a few minutes here when we get to the end of chapter 12. I'm going to tie this into Kings and Chronicles. Don't let me forget to do that, because it's important and it's really cool. Okay, so chapter 12. These are the statutes and rules that you shall be careful to do in the land that Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, has given you to possess. All the days that you live on the earth, you shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess served their Elohim, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. You shall tear down their altars and dash in pieces their pillars and burn their Asherah with fire. You shall chop down the carved images of their Elohim and destroy their name out of that place. You shall not worship Yahweh, your Elohim, in that way. But you shall seek the place that Yahweh, your Elohim, will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. What will that be in the future? Jerusalem. Yeah, you guys got it. God's going to put his name there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contributions that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock, and there you shall eat before Yahweh your Elohim, and you shall rejoice, you and your households, and all that you undertake, in which Yahweh your God has blessed you. So what we just read is called centrality of worship. It's the technical term for this law. Deuteronomy chapter 12 is centrality of worship. And what it means is that Israel is not allowed to go just anywhere and sacrifice anyhow. And if you remember Leviticus chapter 17, a big reason why God disallows them from sacrificing anywhere but the one place is that they're going to do it to goat demons in Leviticus 17. The concern is, if you don't bring your sacrifices to Jerusalem, that's not Jerusalem yet, but the place where the Lord will put his name, and it will be Jerusalem, you're just going to be taking them to a rock, to a tree, to a hill, to a mountain. You're going to make your sacrifices everywhere, and there's nothing stopping you at that point from worshiping the gods of the nations that you're dispossessing from the land. Does that make sense? Okay. Here it goes on. You shall not do according to all that we are doing here today. What's wrong with what we're doing today?
Whatever's right in your own eyes.
Yeah. Where do you see that?
Next verse.
Well, verse 8, but a lot in Judges.
Judges. Yeah, totally. So what we're doing here today, and this is, we've talked a little bit in the past about, like, did they actually make the sacrifices while they were in the wilderness? This is one of the verses that people who are going to argue that they didn't will stand on. When Moses says, don't do according to all that we're doing here today, the plains of Moab, everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. Did they have the tabernacle? Yes.
Yeah.
Were they following the cloud of Yahweh? Yes. Should they have been making sacrifices?
Yeah.
Yes. So whose failure is it that everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes?
Moses.
I'm going to think Moses. But he sure seems to want to blame them for it. It's the woman you gave me. Here he goes again. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance. Ooh, it's starting. The inheritance and the rest go together. You have not yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you. But when you go over the Jordan to live in the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from your enemies all around so that you live in safety, Then to the place that Yahweh your Elohim will choose to make his name dwell there. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and contributions that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to Yahweh. You bring them there to the place that he's going to put his name. When he gives you rest. So, man, I don't read the law as a very restful thing, especially Leviticus. 7 sacrifices, 7 feasts, keeping yourself pure. If you go into the tabernacle and you're not pure, you're going to get killed. But purity isn't a sin, but you're going to have to cleanse yourself on the 3rd day and the 7th day. Like, there's so much to do. It does not sound restful. But the worship of God and the contributions to the tabernacle, all of the things that they're commanded to do, they are able to do because God gives them rest. Will they do it? No, but they could because God's giving them rest. I think that's so cool. Because what it tells me is that the service of Yahweh should be restful. And that when the service of Yahweh is burdensome, we're doing it wrong. Because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Even in the law. I think that's pretty cool.
That's absolutely, that take my yoke upon you, my burden is light, my yoke is easy.
That's what I'm getting at.
That is munus suavissimum in Latin.
Okay.
Under your hat, which means most sweet burden.
Ooh.
It's a burden that does not make you tired or tear you down, but builds you up. Just the opposite of what you're expecting.
That's cool.
All that came from a 40-year-old class a year.
Wow.
My mind is working somehow.
Well, now you're making me think I need to take Latin. So my wife's really going to appreciate you for that. Just finished Greek, and I'm like, ooh, now I have to take Latin.
Cognito ergo sum.
What did you say?
Said I think, therefore I am.
Oh. I'm like, what'd you call me?
I can still conjugate Latin verbs. It's a sickness.
Oh, well, it's not a sickness. It's a blessing, man. Okay, so he says in verse 15, however, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns. That's different.
Yeah.
Right? Remember, because before we got that law about how they weren't allowed to kill animals anywhere but the tabernacle. Because if they were killing animals somewhere other than the tabernacle, they were probably doing it to goat demons.
Doesn't it say above this, though, once you enlarge to the point where it's difficult to come in?
Below.
Yeah.
Below it in verse 20. When Yahweh your God enlarges your territory. Yeah, so we're getting there.
They didn't have town sections.
No, they didn't have towns yet, but they're about to. And when they're within their towns, they can eat meat and slaughter it as much as they desire, according to how Yahweh blesses them. And the unclean and the clean may eat of it. Well, that's certainly different than the tabernacle, because the unclean can't go there. As of the gazelle and as of the deer, only you shall not eat the blood. You pour it out on the earth like water. You may not eat within your town the tithe of your grain, or of your wine, or of your oil, or the firstborn of your herd, or of your flock, or any of your vow offerings that you vow, or your freewill offerings, or the contribution that you present, but you shall eat them before Yahweh your God in the place that Yahweh your Elohim will choose, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite who is within your towns, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your God in all that you undertake. And don't forget about the Levite. So, what's changed? Why did this law change? Or let me put it this way, what's about to change?
Well, I don't know why they, all of a sudden they can,
Well,
when they were
people are
traveling,
spreading
they
out
couldn't do
also.
it outside of the camp, but now, when they've settled, they can, well, it looks like they can eat anything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're all spread
Well,
out.
not anything. There's still the food laws, but anywhere. They can slaughter.
No
and
lobster, no
eat
bacon.
food. Yeah, no lobster, no bacon, no rock badgers,
Yeah.
whatever that was. But there's anywhere. So why the change?
Because they have utterly destroyed all of the things that would keep them away from
Ooh, good idea. I hadn't even thought about that.
If they did it right, they'd be able to do that.
She said because they destroyed all the things that were in worship to other gods.
the world.
Yeah.
That way
What?
they can,
I-
They were supposed to.
they're supposed to, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that way they can they are not, remember how you said they went up to a tree or whatever?
Yes.
Probably.
Yeah.
So when they do it now, all of those things are gone.
That's such a good
It's
point.
Yahweh.
I was just thinking about, because they were in a little camp,
Yes.
and now they're gonna be in the land all
Yeah,
spread
it's
out.
pragmatic.
My goodness, you just gave me a lot to think about. That's a really cool point. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, what were you saying?
I was on the same tack as you. It's just a pragmatic. They all together. Now they're spread out.
Yeah.
And what are they going to say? Oh, you have to go all the way back to one place or whatever?
And what about Reuben and Gad and Manasseh? You gotta
Yeah, they're
cross
on the
the
other side of
Jordan
the
every
river.
time you want a steak.
Yeah. Road trip.
God is blessing them so much that they won't even be able to get back to the tabernacle.
Yeah, totally. They still have to for their
I mean,
tithes
just
and
to,
stuff,
just to
their
slaughter
worship.
an animal for a meal.
But for a meal, right? Yeah, totally. So cool. Verse 20, when Yahweh enlarges your territory, so this is kind of why I was thinking like that they go from a camp to a big thing. As he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you crave meat. I wonder what he's thinking of.
Yeah, quail.
The quail thing, yeah. You may eat meat whenever you desire. If the place that Yahweh your Elohim will choose to put his name is too far from you, then you may kill any of your herd or your flock which Yahweh has given you. And there's the provision that you're talking about. As I have commanded you, and you may eat within your towns whenever you desire. Just as the gazelle or deer is eaten, so you may eat of it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat of it. Only be sure that you don't eat the blood, and it kind of repeats itself. So there you go. But the holy things, the things that are due, you bring to the tabernacle. Don't do that wherever. Bring them to the altar. The blood of your sacrifices shall be poured out on the altar before Yahweh your God. But the flesh you may eat. Be careful to obey all these words that I command you, that it may go well with you and with your children after you forever, whenever you do what is good and right in the sight of Yahweh your God. All right.
So was the land
I
of
got
milk and
3
honey
minutes.
supposed to be Eden?
What?
The land they were going into, if they did it right, and they got rid of all the other idols and everything, and Yahweh was the only God in that land, it would be like Eden. So, and they would handle it like Eden. They would take care of it like Eden. They would.
Yes, but there's a little bit of a difference. There was no meat in Eden. So even as this is picturing Eden, there are also provisions being made for the fact that it's not. Cool? Okay. Got a couple minutes here. When Yahweh, your God, cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in your land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you. And do not inquire about their Elohim, saying, how did these nations serve their Elohim, that I also may do the same? You shall not worship Yahweh, your Elohim, in that way. For every abominable thing that Yahweh hates, they have done for their Elohim. For they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. Everything that I command you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take away from it. What would be like the worst thing that a person in Israel could do? Sacrifice their son or daughter. So we talked about Jephthah before. We're not going to rehash that, especially with such little time left. I want to jump forward to 2 Kings chapter 21.
Moloch.
This guy named Manasseh. Does he tear down the altars of the other gods? In fact, what he does is he builds altars for all the hosts of heaven in the 2 courts of Yahweh's house. So not only is he not taking them out of the whole land, he's putting them into the temple, and he burned his son as an offering.
Oh, that's bad.
Yeah, and this guy's a king of Judah, and he burns his son as an offering. All right, 2 Chronicles.
So that was Ahab?
That was Manasseh.
I thought Manasseh fixed it, no?
There's another Manasseh.
Oh.
There's 2 Manassehs.
Isn't that the way?
Isn't that confusing? Okay, here's the Ahaz one. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, as his father David had done, but he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He even made metal images for the Baals, and he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his son as an offering. You know what the valley of the son of Hinnom is?
Gehenna.
It's Gehenna. So you take, you remember Or and Ma'or from Genesis 1. He made the lights, and then he made the Ma'or, the place for the lights. So in Hebrew, you're going to get a contraction that goes Mahinam. That when you transliterate into Greek is going to go Gehinnom, or get shortened to Gehenna. And what Gehenna is a literal place that was outside the city of Jerusalem. In Jesus' time, it became a dump where they would burn trash. In Ahaz's time, it was a place filled with idols and metal images for the Baals. And the place that Jesus uses as the primary symbolism of what hell is the place where Ahaz burned his son. It's awful, but it is so revealing of what hell scripturally is, and Revelation, Isaiah, we have plenty of evidence that it is a literal place. But that literal place, we don't understand it because it's so far separated from us, but we can look at things like this to understand what hell is telling us is happening in the way that Ahaz was separated from his kid by fire to false gods. That is the separation from Yahweh for people who don't take the fulfillment of the law by Jesus. That's what hell is. And that's what, so to finish up, to close, back in Deuteronomy 12, if we read Deuteronomy 12 in light of those future events in Israel's history, when he says, don't worship me that way by burning your sons in the fire to other Elohim, because that's the abominations that the other nations did. What he's telling Israel to do is to avoid hell, which I think is like, oh man, it's heavy. It's really heavy. It's a big point.
And in the archaeology, you find like carvings with a male figure and a female figure called Yahweh and his Asherah, and like, oh yeah, for real, from pre-Babylon, like right before the exile, and like copies of what the altar was supposed to be like, little horned altars in people's houses,
Oh,
all
yeah.
the idols of everything.
That's crazy.
Yes, so they did exactly
Yep.
not this.
God's like, here's all the things you shouldn't do. They're like, we're going to do them all. Yeah, cool.
Sounds like a challenge.
Yeah, right. They took it as a challenge instead of prohibition. Yeah. Carrie, will you pray for us tonight?
Oh, Father, thank you so much for bringing us together today. Thank you for drawing us into your word, teaching us all of what all of your word has, and just broadening it. Lord, I pray that you would keep everybody safe on the way home. Grant us good study this week and good insights this week, and bring us back to your house safely. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.